All right, so in this video, this is the fourth video of this chapter, chapter 7. We're going to go over bone growth and development. Again, slides 17 through 25 on our McGraw-Hill PowerPoints. So, bone growth and development. The term of creating bone is called ossification. We'll see that in just a minute. And when our body develops our bones, it's going to be along two different lines. There's some bones that are going to be developed by what we refer to as intramembranous ossification, intramembranous bones. And then the other one is endochondrial. Now, just real quick, if I break these down, so I have intramembranous, in between membranes. So if I have a membrane here and a membrane here and that turns to bone, this is generally going to be flat. Intramembranous bones are generally flat bones. Endo, inside, cartilage, chondrial. Endochondrial bones are going to be the long bones, and a lot of the bones we're going to study are going to go through endochondrial ossification, and they start off as a hyaline cartilage model and get turned into bone. Remember when I said that if you ever have a question about cartilage, guess hyaline, because it's the one that's pretty much everywhere. But so intramembranous, between membranes, is going to cause the creation of a flat bone, and endochondrial are going to be creating long bones, and they create it by using a cartilage model, and it starts inside. So at 14 weeks of development, both of these are starting to get going on. Now again, when we're born, not everything is all fused together. For instance, the suture joints in the skull, which you've looked at in lab, they're not going to be together. But you know, the creation of bone is well underway at 14 weeks. Osteogenesis imperfecta is just when we have a collagen deficit, and that's a problem because collagen is one of the big things all over our body, but it is what gives our bone a lot of its strength, and we'll look at that in just a little bit, but in another video actually. So the bones are brittle, and when the baby is born, there's a lot of fractures. This is just a picture of a little baby, and again, when we're sitting here, you can kind of see these little bones right here. They're bones that are being created, and you can kind of see there's a lot of still cartilage in these areas. So intramembranous bones, which we said they form in sheet-like layers of connective tissue, which means they're generally going to be flat bones. And so the process of replacing this connective tissue into bone is called intramembranous ossification. These mesenchymal cells are early pluripotent stem cells. They're not totipotent, which we said, you remember totipotent were where the cells could turn into anything. These were kind of still going on certain pathways. But these mesenchymal cells would turn into osteoblasts. Again, the osteoblasts are these cells that create bone. Right, it says right here. So we looked at this last chapter, our last video, just kind of briefly talking about it. But osteoblasts are immature bone cells. You can kind of remember when you're immature, life is a blast. And they are cells that form bone. Osteoblasts are completely, when osteoblasts are completely surrounded by the matrix, they then can no longer create it, and they retire basically and turn into osteoblasts. Or osteocytes, excuse me. So osteoblasts are the immature cells, and they're creating bone. And when they have walled themselves in into their little lacuna and they can no longer create bone, they turn into the mature bone cells, which we call osteocytes. As these osteoblasts start changing this connective tissue, the intermembranous connective tissue into bone, the mesenchyme on the outside ends up being what the periosteum. So this is a little picture of an osteocyte in the lacuna. But when we look at the process of this, now intramembranous, let me make sure I pronounce that well. Intramembranous, when we look at this, we're not going to be, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want you to know some of the framework of this one. All right, so intramembranous, again, flat bones. We're going to have membranes, connective tissue membranes, which these osteoblasts, as you see right in here, will get in the middle of, and they will start working from the middle and moving outward. And as they're doing this, they're turning this middle part into bone and then pushing the membrane outward. So as they continue to do that, the bone ends up being on these little strands, these webs, which we call trabeculae, and the bone is being created, and it keeps again pushing this mesenchyme out, which is going to be the periosteum. And so we're going to have this area of spongy bone in the middle, some compact bone, just a little ring of dense compact bone on the outside, with the periosteum as this leftover membrane covering it. Now, interchondral bones, endochondrial, inside cartilage, these begin as hyaline cartilage. All right, so they start off as hyaline cartilage, and these are going to be the majority of bones in our body. There's the long bones for sure. Now, endochondrial ossification, as I said, starts as a hyaline bones start as hyaline cartilage, and they turn into bone. And so there's a little process of this. Now, in this, we're going to introduce another couple of cells. One cell is a chondrocyte, which is a cartilage cell. And chondrocytes are going to be in there when it's cartilage. And then as they start dying, and the osteoblasts come in and start taking over, there's another type of cell, and we mentioned this at the end of the last video, called an osteoclast. And again, I hate that I'm having to use this mouse pad to write this, so hopefully you can see that this says osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are a breakdown bone. They're the ones that go in and they, like a little Pac-Man, what they do is they release a little substance and it breaks down that calcium phosphate and releases it. So again, when we're looking at the blood calcium balance, too much calcium in my blood, my body's going to remove that calcium by creating new bone. That's called an osteoblast. When we need calcium to be released into the blood, let's say I have a low blood calcium level, it is osteoclasts that go in and they break down bone, and it releases the calcium into the bloodstream and raise it up. So anyway, right now we're looking at this endochondrial ossification. It is going to have a two-step process. I'm going to have a first step that's called the primary ossification center, and a second step called the secondary ossification center. There is one primary and there ends up being two secondaries. So the primary ossification center, like we said, is at the diaphysis, right in the middle. As this starts turning into bone, as the cartilage is being replaced in the bone, then I'm going to have the epiphyses start. And since they are a second step, they are called secondary ossification centers. And as these two ossification centers get their ossification on, so to speak, they get to a point where the diaphysis and the epiphysis start getting close to each other, and we call this the epiphyseal plate. In layman's terms, this is called the growth plate. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, how bones grow. So this is the picture kind of showing how it works. So we start off as a hyaline cartilage model here. What is going to happen is I'm going to start having the little perichondrium, the outer membrane of the cartilage, start thickening, which is eventually to turn into the periosteum. But what that does is it cuts off blood supply to get in or to get out for these chondrocytes in the middle, these ones right in here. And these chondrocytes are going to go through a process called atrophy. Atrophy means that they are going to, or hypertrophy, which they will eventually go through atrophy, but hypertrophy is like I like to mispronounce it. Hypertrophy, they are going to start swelling and die. And so you can kind of see how much bigger these are in here. So they've gone through hypertrophy, and so they're dying. And as they die, a blood vessel will weasel its way in right into this middle part and start dropping off osteoblasts along with osteoclasts. And if you've ever seen one of those home makeover shows where you get people that come into an old house and they look at it and they're like, oh yeah, I can do this and that, I think that's quite a talent. They see the framework and they're like, okay, we can do that. That's kind of what goes on here. The osteoblasts are going to take these round bubbles that are left over of these hypertrophic calcium cells or chondrocytes and turn it into calcium. And so I've got this little weird framework of calcium, rebar basically, supports for this house. Osteoclasts will go in and then start taking out the ones that are unneeded. What ends up happening is I start creating this hollow middle layer called the medullary cavity. Now, since this is where everything is starting, this is called the primary ossification center. The primary ossification center, like we said, is in the diaphysis. Now, as this starts getting a foothold and it's spreading, both in every direction, it's spreading widthwise and lengthwise, up and down and side to side. As that's happening, then I'm going to have a secondary ossification center start in the epiphyses. I'll have these little blood vessels that will weasel their way into that and start dropping off osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Now, with this, because these cartilage cells did not become hypertrophied, they didn't swell up, there's not these little cavities, these big cavities like there is in this one, all right? They're still fairly small. And so as that happens, they don't have the luxury of having these big things. So where the medullary cavity is, they end up having these smaller ones that are going to be end up being the spongy bone, and that's why that ends up being mainly spongy bone. And so they end up having their own separate little place. And then, as it says, we have this little band of cartilage that remains between the diaphysis and the two epiphyses. And these are called epiphyseal plate. These are what allow the bone to grow lengthwise. And so we'll see this in a future video. But as the bone is growing lengthwise, as you're aging, these little plates stay cartilage. Now, around the age of 20 to 22, these are going to eventually fill in. They'll turn to bone. They become then, instead of the epiphyseal plate, they have a remnant that we call the epiphyseal line. And at that point, the person cannot grow any taller because the bones are not going to be able to grow lengthwise. And so, the big things to keep out to take out of this endochondrial ossification is mainly long bones. It's going to start off as a hyaline cartilage model. It's going to have two steps called ossification centers. The first step is going to be in the diaphysis. It's going to be where these cells, these cartilage cells, are going to start going through hypertrophy. They're going to swell up and die because they can't get blood to them or away. As this happens, the blood vessel comes in, drops off osteoblasts and osteoclasts. It creates the medullary cavity and starts turning it into bone. And that's why it's called the primary ossification center. As this starts happening, then I'm going to have blood vessels come into the epiphyses, still drop off our wonderful osteoblasts and osteoclasts and start turning that into bone. And since it didn't go through hypertrophy, it's spongy bone. But there's going to be a little layer of hyaline cartilage between the epiphysis and the diaphysis called the epiphyseal plate that allows for growth lengthwise. These will stay active until roughly 20 to 22 years old, when they will ossify or close up, and at that point they're called the epiphyseal line. So that is how bones kind of grow. This is the development of them. Again, we've got, it's called ossification. We have endochondrial ossification and intramembranous. Intramembranous is mainly flat bones. Endochondrial is going to be mainly long bones. All right, I hope that is good, and we will see you in the next video.